Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Rahul Mahajan. He's a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond. Hi, Rahul.
Hi, Sonali.
Thousands of NYPD officers turned their backs to Mayor Bill de Blasio once more, this time during the funeral of Wen Jianliu, one of two cops to have been killed by a lone shooter 2 weeks ago. The display of tensions was a repeat of what took place at the other officer's funeral a week earlier. Meanwhile, a New York judge is now reviewing whether or not to release proceedings from a secret grand jury decision to not indict NYPD officer Daniel Pantaleo over the choking death of Eric Garner. That decision fueled ongoing protests around the nation, which continue today. In Ferguson over the weekend, a symbolic Black People's Grand Jury convened to investigate Michael Brown's death. And in Los Angeles, a small group of activists has set up an occupation in front of the LAPD's headquarters after a new autopsy of Ezell Ford, an unarmed black man killed by officers, was released just before New Year's Eve. That action has received no media coverage so far. Well, Rahul, do you foresee that the activism over Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Ezell Ford's deaths continue in full force into this new year?
Well, yesterday I walked outside my apartment and I live in a lower middle class suburban area, strip malls and quiet depression. And as soon as I walked out, I saw a Black Lives Matter protest in a very out of the normal area by a group that wasn't one of the usual suspects. I do think that these protests are going to last because there are going to be continual provocations. Every time another unarmed black man gets killed by the police, it's going to be news for a national movement. Conversely, however, the police have very clearly asserted themselves and shown their power, especially in New York. And the next question will be, will this burgeoning movement actually have a strategy that has any likelihood of achieving change in policy?
And then accused Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev starts phase one of his trial this morning. A guilty decision is all but guaranteed, and the only question remaining is whether Tsarnaev will be sentenced to death or would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole for his role in an attack that killed 3 people and injured 264 others. Despite his opposition to the death penalty, Attorney General Eric Holder has announced an exception in this case. He cited Tsarnaev's, quote, especially heinous, cruel, and depraved manner. According to CNN, quote, among the evidence prosecutors are expected to use against him are statements claiming to be angry at U.S. wars that killed Muslims in Afghanistan and Iraq. Rahul, what do you make of the seeming lack of debate surrounding this trial? I mean, if you're against the death penalty, shouldn't you be against it for everyone? And why is opposition to U.S. wars considered an acceptable form of evidence?
It's funny. I think that we have a moral climate here in the United States where, Osama bin Laden is considered worse than Hitler. And any Muslim who makes anything explode is obviously worse than even a mass murderer who uses a gun and happens to be white. And so it's only in that context that this is a more heinous, cruel, and depraved act than many of the others that get committed by people who don't necessarily get to calls for the death penalty. I think it is a terrible act, and if you were in favor of the death penalty, this is the kind of crime you might seek it for. But if you're against it, as Holder claims to be, I don't see that this is so far out of the ordinary that he ought to change his mind.
Right. And finally, in Guatemala, Efrain Rios Montt will also stand trial today for genocide committed against that nation's indigenous population. It is the second time the former Guatemalan dictator will stand trial. An earlier conviction was annulled. Rios Montt oversaw a dark period in Guatemala's history, which involved the torture, rape, and murder of thousands of people and persecution of left-wing guerrillas. He had strong support from the United States for his actions, in particular the CIA. Well, Rahul, in light of the terrorism trial in the U.S. against Dzhokhar Tsarnaev that we were just discussing, how do you view this trial?
Well, I think it's heartening to see just how much in Latin America there is an attempt to actually hold people to account for the horrible crimes of the 70s. And in the case of Rios Montt, it's been difficult. An earlier verdict against him was vacated, and Guatemala hasn't had the sort of dramatic change and liberalization of its political atmosphere that some of the South American countries have. So it's heartening to see they're still moving forward with it. What's unfortunate, of course, is that none of his facilitators in the United States are ever going to stand trial or actually even going to be accused of complicity in his crimes.
Rahul, always a pleasure to have you on. We will talk to you again next week.
See you then.
Rahul Mahajan is a sociologist and author of Full Spectrum Dominance, U.S. Power in Iraq and Beyond, and one of our daily Newsflash guest experts.